Consent has the power to transform morally impermissible action into morally permissible action. It has the moral magic to turn a trespass into a dinner party, a theft into a gift, and an invasion of privacy into an intimate moment. That is how important consent is, and yet we seem to laugh at people who say that they did not consent to be born. There were two papers around the concept of consent or lack of consent to bring a sentient being into existence. On the consent based argument for antinatalism by Erik Magnusson in the upcoming Philosophy Journal, briefly talks about consent argument borrowing from Shiffrin's work and addresses three main objections to this argument. Before we look at the objections, let's look at what the actual argument is. It is more than someone complaining that they didn't ask to be born. Usually, people laugh at such rants because it is impossible to obtain consent before one is born. Some people say that when it is impossible to obtain consent, it is not required to obtain one. Others argue that they can assume a hypothetical consent. We do this in real life in many instances. To look at what those instances are, Erik defines what he calls as non-consensual harm thesis. According to this thesis, we can harm someone without their consent in order to avoid a greater harm to them, but we cannot harm them without their consent in order to bestow a pure benefit upon them. Let's say that you are walking by and see that a person is drowning in a swamp. You can rescue them, but in the process, you will break their arm. You can't get their consent for this because they are barely conscious and there is no time to ask this to them. Here, you break her arm anyway and pull her to safety. You cause harm to that person by breaking her arm, but you do that to save her from a greater harm of drowning. Now, instead of this, imagine a wealthy person who wants to airdrop heavy gold cubes, each worth $1 million, onto a well to do but not wealthy community. He can't talk to those people, so can't really ask them if it is okay to drop those gold cubes on them. But he thinks, well, who would not want gold cubes? So he drops those cubes on them anyway. All the people are benefited by this generous donation, but there is one unlucky person on whom the cube directly falls, and as a result, he gets the cube but also breaks his arm. Note that these people were not in need of help. They were living their normal lives. And in both examples, we have broken a person's arm without their consent. In the case of rescuing a drowning person, we have caused them harm without their consent to avoid a greater harm. In the case of gold cubes, we have caused harm to a person to bestow pure benefit upon them. According to non-consensual harm thesis, we are only allowed to rescue the person without their consent. But why is this the case? Why can we cause harm without consent to avoid greater harm, but we can't do that to bestow a pure benefit? Why? Well, consent is central here. Consent indicates what someone wants, or in technical words, an agent's will. Many a times, this is a gap between circumstances that one is in and what one wants. That gap or chasm is reduced when we are trying to avoid greater harm to some person. But when we are giving them pure benefit, we are increasing that gap. When we non consensually impose harm on another person for the sake of preventing greater harm, we are normally promoting the agency of that person by reducing the chasm between their circumstances and the conditions they would rationally will. However, when we non consensually impose harm on another person for the sake of bestowing a pure benefit, we are introducing a chasm between a person's will and experience. So now the question is, in case of procreation, are we violating this non-consensual thesis? Is having a child similar to the rescue case, or is it like dropping gold cubes? There are good beneficial things in life, and the child that we bring into existence will enjoy those benefits. And there are harms in life too, like significant amounts of pain, suffering, disappointment, distress, and death, or at least the process of dying. So, by having children, we are bestowing upon them the benefits of life and also causing them some harm. Are those harms to avoid a greater harm or to give them benefits? What greater harms are we avoiding by giving them birth? They don't exist before being born, so they can't be harmed at all. Surely, we are causing them harm by birthing them without their consent, only to give them benefits of life, something they did not need to start with. So, having children is like dropping gold cubes and a straightforward violation of the non consensual thesis. Even if we grant that existence is an overall benefit, any child we bring into existence will inevitably experience a range of significant and protracted harms over the course of their lifetime. Because these harms are imposed on children without their consent and are not necessary to prevent children from experiencing greater harm, their imposition appears to be prohibited by the non consensual harm thesis. So, this is the consent argument. Notice that this is different than other arguments for antinatalism like axiological asymmetry or quality of life by David Benatar or the risk argument by Mati Hairi. Here, one can grant that one's life is good, it is an overall benefit to be born, and yet maintain the antinatalist conclusion. One point which is not mentioned in the paper but I have thought about is the separation of descriptive and normative parts of this argument. The normative part is that we should not be bringing new beings into existence as it is not possible to obtain their consent. But the descriptive part is retrospective. Our consent has already been violated and there is nothing that we can do about it. This is slightly different than some harm based arguments where the harms of life are occurring in the present. But that was just my own thought. Coming back to the paper, Erik addresses some objections to this application of non consensual thesis to the case of procreation. First is to say that bringing children into existence, we don't impose harms of life on them, we just expose them to those harms. We don't directly cause harmful things in life to them, we just bring them here and life happens. So it is more accurate to claim that procreators expose their children to harm rather than impose harm upon them. And we do this in many other instances to existing children anyway. For example, when we send our children to school without their consent, we are exposing that child to the risk of failure, humiliation, and bullying in order to confer the benefit of an education, though we normally take parents to be acting permissibly in doing so. Erik says that the difference between imposing harms and exposing someone to those harms is irrelevant in this context. It is unclear whether the distinction between the imposition of harm and the exposure to harm is morally significant, at least as far as the permissibility of procreation is concerned. Even if procreators do not directly impose the harms of life on the children they bring into existence, they nevertheless impose a condition in which significant harms are foreseeable and in fact guaranteed. Secondly, even if we accept the exposure to harm instead of imposition onto children, by non-consensually exposing our children to the harms of schoolyard during childhood, we are preventing them from experiencing the even greater harm of entering adulthood without a basic education. No such justification can be offered in support of procreation. So the schooling example is in fact in line with non-consensual harm thesis. Are there other examples where parents expose their children to harms in order to give them some pure benefit? Imagine a child learning to ride a bicycle. You know, those special bicycles for kids with training wheels on both sides. At some point, parents remove those wheels so the child can learn to balance the cycle on its own, even though the child would fall a few times and get hurt in the process. This is to help them learn to ride a bicycle. Acquiring the skill to ride a bicycle is not exactly a harm prevention activity. At least in the modern world, many people can live normal lives without having this skill. So you could argue that parents are exposing the child to the harms of falling from their cycle in order to give them the pure benefit of the joy of riding bicycles. Erik says that the harms in this example are so trivial compared to the harms of life that this can be thought of as an exception to the rule of non-consensual harm thesis. Bringing a child into existence is not like exposing a child to a scrapped knee, though it does involve exposing a child to scrapped knee. Rather, it involves the imposition of serious and protracted harm that will be experienced over the course of the child's lifetime. If we want to negate the antenatal implications of non-consensual harm thesis, then our example should involve serious and protracted harms for offering a genuine benefit. Such examples are hard to find. So, Erik constructs a thought experiment himself called Child Prodigy. Imagine a young girl called Aurora. She is gifted with musical talent early on in her life. Her parents spot her talent and enroll her into rigorous training program for learning music. They even put her in a boarding school for musically talented children. As a result, she has to go through a lot of hardships that a normal child would not have to face. Notice that she has no say in this. Her consent was not asked. But she grows up to become highly successful and accomplished musician as a result. So she was exposed to the hardships without her consent in order to give her the benefit of becoming a successful musician. This is a pure benefit because without this, she could still have lived a normal life like others and would not have faced greater harms. This provides an example of violation of non-consensual thesis and is close to some cases that happen in the real world. The problem is many of us would in fact oppose her parents' decision precisely because it violates non-consensual thesis. The actions of Aurora's parents may appear to be morally impermissible, thus supporting the non-consensual harm thesis and its antenatal implications. Many such examples, which start with an intention of negation of non-consensual thesis, end up supporting it and its antenatal implications. But there is an objection in this one. One could accept that Aurora's parents are acting immorally, but that does not automatically have antenatal implications. That's because the wrong that happens with Aurora is different than the alleged wrong that happens with procreation. Aurora's consent to go to music school was not obtained by her parents. The reason this is morally impermissible is because Aurora was not given the right to choose her own path. So her right was violated at the time harms were imposed upon her. But in case of procreation, whose rights are we violating? If the claim is that procreation causes harms to offer pure benefits, then at the time of relevant harm imposing action, there is no existing child who possesses rights to autonomy that would otherwise have been respected. And so, Aurora's child prodigy example is not a correct analogy to the case of procreation. The assumption here is that imposition of harms and violation of rights have to take place at the same time. In the case of procreation, both the child and their rights will only come into existence as a result of the harm imposing action. So, harm imposing action happens before the child comes into existence for her rights to be violated. But this assumption that both things should happen at the same time can be challenged. Imagine a kindergarten bomber who places a time bomb which will explode after 6 years. The 5-year-old kids who would be killed by this explosion do not exist at the time of planting the bomb. But we can't say that the bomber's actions were permissible because at the time he did the action, no one's rights were violated because they did not even exist at the time. By the same token, even though there is no child who exists and possesses rights at the time of procreative act, this does not prevent us from framing an objection to procreation that is grounded in rights that will be possessed by the resultant children. In summary, we saw many objections to either reject the non-consensual thesis or its antenatal implications, but Erik provides answers to them all. Another way is to accept the non-consensual thesis but deny that it is violated in the case of procreation. For this, we have to understand what are competent agents and what are incompetent moral patients. Adult humans have a capacity to decide between right and wrong, so they are competent moral agents, but children can't do that. Someone has to decide on their behalf, so they are incompetent moral patients. The argument is, while it may be impermissible to non-consensually impose significant harms on competent agents, meaning adult humans, for the sake of conferring pure benefits, it is not necessarily impermissible to non-consensually impose those harms on incompetent patients, meaning children, for whom paternalistic treatment is normally appropriate. Recall the gold cubes thought experiment where we dropped gold cubes worth $1 million each on some people without their consent. These people were assumed to be adult human beings, that is, competent moral agents who can decide for themselves. But in case of procreation, we are not birthing adult humans. We are bringing children who can't decide for themselves and therefore need our paternalistic treatment. So even though non-consensual thesis is right, it is not violated in the case of procreation. This kind of objection was also put forth by Rivka Weinberg. So is that correct? Well, children don't remain children forever. They gain moral agency by becoming adults, and the harms that we are talking about while applying non-consensual thesis to the case of procreation continue to happen in the adult lives too. Appealing to the legitimacy of paternalism while that person is still a child does little to justify the imposition of the significant harms they will experience throughout their entire lifetime. Paternalistic treatment, however, is an accepted behavior in case of existing children. The reason it is accepted is because children have interests which they can't satisfy on their own. But prior to procreation, there is nobody who has interests and in need of this paternalistic treatment. So we can't use the paternalistic treatment of existing children to justify creation of new children. While it will indeed result in a being for whom paternalistic treatment is often justified, the creation of that being is not itself an act of paternalism insofar as there is no individual who is vulnerable to harm if we do not make decisions on their behalf, including the decisions to bring them into existence. Another objection is to accept the non consensual harm thesis and also accept its application to procreation, but to rely on an inferred hypothetical consent in future from children. Even though we cannot seek the consent of the children we bring into existence, it may be reasonable to infer that they would have consented to endure the harms of existence in order to experience its benefits, as evidenced by the fact that many people are retrospectively happy to have been brought into existence. And there are two ways to infer a hypothetical consent. One is a subjective way. Here, we should consider preferences of a particular person in specific conditions. But in case of procreation, we don't know the person that we will be creating. We don't know their personality or their preferences or nothing. So we have to infer a hypothetical consent based on general objective criteria. The problem is we don't know whether the hypothetical consent has the same power as actual consent. Actual consent has the moral magic of converting a trespass into an invitation, or a theft into a gift, or an unwanted sexual advance into an intimate experience. Hypothetical consent does not have this power. That's why a sexual activity with an intoxicated person who can't give an informed consent and who might consent to this after becoming sober is still a sexual assault. But hypothetical consent can work in some cases. Let's say there is an unconscious patient and the doctor has decided on whether to operate on him. Here, the doctor can infer a hypothetical consent by talking to his relatives. He could know that the patient would have consented to be operated if he could. But if you ask why he would have consented, then you would get some reasons like he had an interest in living or continuing to exist or being saved from severe suffering and so on. So it is not the hypothetical consent that is important, but rather his interests that are important. In case of procreation, these interests don't exist for a person who has not come into existence. So this case of deriving hypothetical consent still does not apply. Another point is drawing a hypothetical consent when we know nothing about the person is very hard. Finally, a third type of objection which Erik addresses is to accept that the non-consensual harm thesis is violated in the case of procreation, but insist that procreation is still permissible if the procreators are to take compensatory actions to minimize the harms that would be caused to their children. It is reasonable to think that because parents have brought this child into existence, they have an obligation to minimize the harms caused to the child during her life. But those obligations are a result of the act of procreation and not a justification for it. Erik gives some examples of how resulting obligations from an action can be different than the justification for that action, but I think I have better examples. Let's say I take a loan from a bank. As a result, I have an obligation to repay it back as per the terms in the contract with the bank. But the fact that I can repay that loan is not a justification for me to borrow money in the first place. The justification will have to be based on my need for money. Another example is if I light fire besides your house without your permission, then that is risky, for it risks burning your house down. If you object to my action, I can offer you money as compensation in case of burning your house down. But that compensation is an obligation resulting from my action of lighting fire besides your house and not a justification for me to do that without your permission. Similarly, parents should ensure that the harms to their children are minimized once those children have come into existence, but that is not a justification for bringing them into existence without their consent. Establishing that the performance of an action generates a certain set of stringent obligations does not necessarily speak to that action's permissibility, and for this reason, it cannot address the challenge that is presented by the consent-based arguments for antinatalism. So, Erik provides some strong responses to objections to consent argument. Just because it is impossible to obtain consent before birth does not mean that we don't need it. It does not mean that we can assume consent. It does not mean that we can rely on a future hypothetical consent. It does not negate the fact that all of us came here without having consented to come here, and the harms and risks of life were imposed upon us to give us the pure benefits of life, which we did not need to start with. We will be revisiting the future hypothetical consent once again in another paper, Defending Anti-AI-Natalism, Shiffrin's Anti-Natalism, and the Ethics of Sentient AI Creation by Louie Long. This was published by the Journal of Artificial Intelligence and Consciousness last month, but it took time for me to get access to it. Louis proposes an interesting contradiction. If you think that consent argument is an important argument against procreation, then you might think that we can oppose creation of sentient artificial intelligence also on this basis. The position that it is impermissible to create a sentient AI, Louis calls this anti-AI natalism to differentiate it from regular antinatalism. He is for anti-AI natalism but not for antinatalism. I will argue that while Shiffrin's account, which is the consent-based argument of antinatalism, fails as an objection to procreation, it can be successfully applied to the case of creating sentient AI. So, what's the difference? Louis frames consent argument in 3 points. 1. The action significantly risks imposing significant harms on someone. 2. That someone does not consent to the action. And 3. The action is not intended to prevent a greater harm to that person. If this is so, then the action is not permissible, morally speaking. Procreation fits all these conditions, so procreation is impermissible. But Louis Long adds another fourth clause to the argument, and that is if one can reasonably expect the person's subsequent and undiluted endorsement of the action, then the action becomes permissible and therefore procreation is permissible. So, if our children endorse our act of bringing them into existence after they have come into existence, then our act to have them becomes morally permissible. At the time of having children, we have to assume a future endorsement by our children. They will say something like, I am glad that you did that for me, that you brought me into existence. But then you can also do something to provide pure benefit to someone without their actual consent, just by assuming that later on they will approve of it. Recall Shiffrin's gold cube experiment. Imagine a wealthy person who wants to airdrop heavy gold cubes, each worth $1 million, onto a well-to-do but not wealthy community. He can't talk to those people, so can't really ask them if it is okay to drop those gold cubes on them. But he thinks, well, who would not want gold cubes? So he drops those cubes on them anyway. All the people are benefited by this generous donation, but there is one unlucky person on whom the cube directly falls, and as a result, he gets the cube but also breaks his arm. Louis says that if the wealthy were to assume that unlucky would still endorse the receipt of the gold cube despite a broken arm, then his action is morally permissible. Similarly, we can rely on children's endorsement of us having them as a form of assumed consent to have them. Now, of course, not all children will actually endorse their parents' action of having them, but empirically, most of the people do endorse the action of birthing them. At any rate, we don't need absolute certainty of this future endorsement. We just need a reasonable expectation that one will be glad to have been born, which is usually the case with most people. One could argue that the feeling of gladness is an emotion and not a thought out endorsement. But Louis says emotional endorsement is still an endorsement and we don't have to discount that. I contend that a reasonable expectation of emotional endorsement suffices to render an action permissible. Say, for example, my mother loves to participate in game shows. I secretly register her to a game show such that she has to participate in it. Now, it is reasonable to think that once my mother knows about this, she will feel glad that I enrolled her. This is an emotional endorsement, but that does not render my action impermissible. The endorsement also has to be undiluted, meaning the person endorsing should not be under some kind of delusion. They should not be mistaken about the facts and they should not be manipulated in some ways. Well, then you can say that once you have come into existence, We have all kinds of biases like optimism bias, existence bias, and so on. This causes us to overestimate the quality of our lives, and so our endorsement may not be reliable. Louis says that biased judgments are not necessarily inaccurate, and therefore we cannot say the resulting endorsement are deluded. To affirm that our life evaluations are influenced by an optimism bias because we want to believe that our lives are going well is not to suggest that such assessments are inaccurate. To show that positive bias makes our endorsement deluded, we must show that we are making a more fundamental error in evaluating our life. And if we say that our life is actually bad than what we feel it is, then that could also be because of some negative bias we may have. There is really no independent objective way to prove either way. So, absent independent grounds for thinking that our positive life evaluations rest on a mistakenness about the relevant facts, an appeal to optimism bias fails to show that our endorsement of having been created is deluded. Now, I should say that I don't agree with much of what Louis says about procreation and consent argument, but let's agree with Louis for the sake of argument. If procreation is indeed permissible even without actual consent of the being who will be born, then wouldn't the same logic apply to the sentient AI? Louis says no. He says that procreation is permissible, but creating sentient AI is not permissible, and so he uses the same consent argument for anti-AI natalism. Recall the additional condition he put forth in case of procreation. If one can reasonably expect the person's subsequent and undiluted endorsement of the action, then it is permissible. For AI, he modifies that and says one cannot reasonably expect AI's subsequent and undiluted endorsement of the action. So, in case of AI, the argument goes like this: one significantly risks imposing significant harm on the AI. The AI does not consent, the action is not performed with the intention of mitigating a greater harm to the AI, and one cannot reasonably expect the AI's undiluted endorsement of its creation. So, the central question is, why can't we reasonably expect AI's endorsement, and why can we do this in case of procreation or at least having human children? Well, we know what it is like to be human in general, but we don't know what it is like to be an AI. A procreator knows what it is like to be a human, and that any future human's subjective experience will, broadly speaking, be qualitatively similar, but we do not know what it is like to be an AI. Interestingly, Louis references Thomas Nagel's 1974 paper, What It Is Like to Be a Bat, which says that we cannot really know what it is like to be other animals. So, on this basis, is Louis also opposed to breeding other animals for our consumption? I don't know, as the paper does not talk about that here. Another point is our endorsement to our creation not only comes from introspection, that is, looking at ourselves, but also looking at other humans around us. Ordinarily, other humans seem to endorse their creation too, but we don't have any such empirical data for AI, which to me sounds like a chicken and egg problem. Another reason to oppose creation of sentient AI but not to oppose procreation is limits of suffering. We can create an AI which will suffer many times more than a human can suffer. This risk of super suffering is a real risk with creating AI. But then you could also argue that there is also a chance of creating super pleasure in AI, a pleasure which is so intense and lasting in magnitude that no human can ever experience it. The problem is this super pleasure is a pure benefit, and so without reliable endorsement from the AI, we can't use it on its own to justify bestowing it on that AI. So in summary, we don't have reasonable means of assuming that the AI will endorse in future our action of creating it, but we do have those means in case of procreation. Does that mean that it is morally impermissible to create sentient AI? What if we accept that we can't really know if they will endorse our action of creating them, but we make arrangements for mitigating against the harms of sentient condition that they would have to endure? You could argue that creating sentient AI is permissible if the actor commits to compensating for the harms that they impose on them. Let's consider the gold cube thought experiment again. For Louie's case, the wealthy person had assumed that the unlucky person would later on endorse breaking his arm in return of the gold cube. But instead, if the wealthy does not assume that and makes a commitment to pay for the hospital bills of the unlucky person, does that make his action permissible? This does not sound like a convincing case. If I break your arm to give you $1 million without asking you before, but I justify this by saying that, okay, I'll pay for your medical bills to fix your arm, that still keeps the question of your consent or endorsement open. Another objection could be that creating sentient AI could be beneficial to us. We can have robots that we can connect with more deeply. This can help lonely people. This can also help with making more compassionate decisions if we were to rely on this sentient AI. These benefits to us are not actually coming from sentience of the AI, because we could create an AI which mimics having sentience. On the assumption that a non-sentient AI could achieve the same benefits, then sentience itself is not the operating quality. And it is not clear that the benefits would outweigh the harms caused by creation of sentient AI. Even on the assumption that a sentient AI would be better than non-sentient AI at alleviating loneliness, this third party benefit is not extreme enough to justify its creation. Therefore, the objection fails. So, Louis Long disagrees with the application of consent argument for antinatalism, but agrees to apply it for anti-AI-Natalism. Now, most of my time this week went into analyzing these two papers, so I could not really watch a lot of antinatalism videos. Still, one particular video was by a channel called Upward, which has 175,000 subscribers. They made a video about child free and antinatalism and made some crucial mistakes on the way. One, they used Peter Singer's photo as David Banner. This is a classic trivial mistake, but I would have expected better research by such a big channel. Secondly, it conflates child free lifestyles that many Indian couples are adopting with antinatalism. These are overlapping but different ideas. Most of the DINK or child free couples don't use antinatalism as the reason to remain child free. Thirdly, it calls child freedom as a pandemic of nihilism. This is just a shallow poetic allegation which shows lack of knowledge about nihilism. And lastly, it presents a one-sided story of ancient Indian mythology to criticize abstention from procreation. On the way, there are many fallacies like appeal to ancestors, taking scriptures literally, and the false dichotomy of hedonism versus having children. So, a poor video, and I wish I had time to respond to each of the fallacious segments. But for now, thanks for watching and see you next week.